Okay. It is on. It is on. All right. I think we have overcome our technical difficulties, at least temporarily, for the time being. Because it's always something, because Mercury is always in retrograde. And so, anyway. So, good morning again.
Good morning.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
It is also Passover. Tomorrow is Earth Day. Today is also the Queen's birthday. She's Queen of England's birthday. She is 93. So, a day layered with many blessings, many events, and grief. Grief, as always.
That's better.
As I was driving up the canyon this morning, I got the news that of the bombings in Sri Lanka. 200 dead, restaurants, hotels, churches bombed. So, as always, we are present with joy and sorrow, with grief and praise, each and every day of our lives. So I would like to open with this invocation, this blessing from Joe Poor. Mother, Father, God, universal power, remind us daily of the sanctity of all life. Touch our hearts with the glorious oneness of all creation as we strive to respect all the living things, all the living beings on this planet. Penetrate our souls with the beauty of this earth as we attune ourselves to the rhythm and flow of the seasons. Awaken our minds with the knowledge to achieve a world in perfect harmony, and grant us the wisdom to realize that we can have heaven on earth. I invite us now into a time of meditation and reflection. And so as you're comfortable doing so, close your eyes perhaps, relax into your chair. Take a couple of long, slow, deep breaths. And let's just let those cares and troubles melt away down into the waiting arms of the earth. When I was a kid, Easter Sunday, we'd all get up and go to church. And then afterwards, there was usually some kind of a picnic if the weather was nice, and an Easter egg hunt. And all the kids would run around trying to find those dyed eggs, those dyed hard-boiled eggs. But always somewhere out there was the golden egg. It was a very special egg. And of course, everybody competed for that. But there was also something wondrous about that particular egg. It was special. And so I invite you now to think about something like that, something that brings you wonder, brings you joy. Perhaps it's not quite as present as it used to be. Take a few moments to find that golden egg and bring it present. So when we look at our coins and our dollar bills and bills in our pockets and our wallets, we see the words "In God We Trust" printed or embossed on them. And that wasn't always the case. And there's a story there. It's a long and somewhat complicated one that reflects an old division in American life. Because originally colonial America was mostly unchurched, and it wasn't really the model of piety that we're presented with today. Religious colonies like the Puritans were the exception, not really the rule, and active religious adherents in colonial times hovered around 20 to 35% of the population. People who declared themselves of a particular faith and were pretty enthusiastic about it. And so most of the folks were vaguely Protestant, and they were probably more likely to understand spells and potions and omens than theological doctrines. And then a series of Protestant religious revivals, collectively known as the Great Awakenings, took place. And historians and theologians identify 3 or 4 bursts of religious enthusiasm that took place between the early 18th century and the late 20th century. And each of these great awakenings was characterized by widespread revivals led by evangelical Protestant ministers, a sense of transformation on the part of those affected, and an increase in evangelical church membership. And so church religious adherence bumped up to around 60 or 70% and pretty much stayed there until recently. And one of those religious revivals took place in the mid-20th century, but it was a little different from the earlier ones, because it was the beginning of a coalition of business and religious forces to impose a set of Christian libertarian ideas about politics and business on the people of the United States. And it was led by white evangelicals, and it could be understood as a deliberate campaign to combat the social gospel of Jesus and turn back the New Deal. Because since the 1930s, leading industrialists had sought to counter the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt had sold his New Deal to the voters in part by explaining economic justice in terms of the social gospel, a progressive interpretation of Christian doctrine. And after a couple of failed ad campaigns, these businessmen went looking for ministers to make the case against the New Deal, and they found them. And so the ministers and these business interests come together around a common set of values, which saw the New Deal and the labor union's new power as forces of pagan statism. And through that common enemy, they make an argument that Christianity and capitalism are one and the same. And they use the catchphrase, freedom under God, which basically means freedom from governmental oversight of business and religious oversight of government and the people. And in his presidential campaign of 1952, Dwight Eisenhower takes the language that these Christian libertarians are promoting and weds it to the state. And instead of freedom under God, as opposed to government, he promotes government under God. He promotes one nation under God and the motto, in God we trust. And so a campaign is launched by conservative pulpits and certain business interests to promote these ideas. And it's ostensibly to fight godless communism, but it's a much older campaign to enshrine these ideas into American life. And it succeeds so well that most of those born in that era, including me, think America is indeed a Christian nation, and that all these structures and things are in place, and it's just kind of always been that way. And one of the first casualties of this campaign is the Pledge of Allegiance. The first pledge was composed in August of 1892 by Francis Bellamy, who was a Baptist minister and a Christian socialist. And his original pledge says, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." And a little time later, in 1942, this gets modified to read, sorry. It was modified to read, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." And then, in 1954, the newly baptized as a Presbyterian President Eisenhower attends a sermon by the Reverend George Dougherty, in which the Reverend says, "To omit the words 'under God' in the Pledge of Allegiance is to omit the definitive factor in the American way of life." Dougherty felt that "under God" was broad enough to include Jews and Muslims, although he discounted atheists. Because an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms. If you deny the Christian ethic, you fall short of the American ideal of life. The week of Dougherty's sermon, bills were introduced in Congress to add the phrase to the pledge, and Eisenhower signed the act into law on Flag Day, June 14th of 1954. It's worth noting that Dougherty was known for his support of racial equality. His church was often a home for civil rights and anti-war demonstrations. He was with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, during one of the civil rights marches in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday. He criticized the Vietnam War from his pulpit even when Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was in the congregation. It's a complicated story. And for many decades, it had been the practice of most public schools in the United States to start the day with prayer and either religious instruction or readings from the Bible. And two legal challenges put an end to that. In one, the state of New York had created what became known as the Regent's Prayer for school children to recite at the beginning of the day. And it went, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen." And the intention was that such a generic prayer would have a wide appeal and could not possibly offend anyone, which it didn't at the time. Not even the ACLU took offense. And it was struck down not because of its religious content, but because it was composed by the government. And because the state wrote it, it crossed the line that separated church and state. The other legal challenge was brought by the parents of Ellery Shemp, a 16-year-old Unitarian enrolled in Abingdon High School in the suburbs north of Philadelphia. Because a 1949 Pennsylvania statute required teachers in Pennsylvania public schools to read, and I quote, "at least 10 verses from the Holy Bible," end quote, to their classes each morning without comment or be fired from their jobs. The Shemps rightfully contended that the statute violated their families' rights under the First and 14th Amendments, and the district courts agreed, striking down the Pennsylvania law. A similar case was brought by Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who filed suit against the Maryland school system to make them cease compulsory prayer and Bible reading in public schools. And as it went before the Supreme Court, the two cases were consolidated. The Supreme Court upheld the opinions of the lower courts in declaring such laws unconstitutional. The Shemp's name is not well known these days, but because she was a vocal atheist, Madalyn Murray O'Hair becomes notorious and is, and I quote Life magazine, the most hated woman in America. Now here's the part that most of us don't know about. In reaction to the decisions by the courts, the U.S. Congress drafted more than 150 resolutions to overturn these rulings by amending the Constitution. And the one that they united around was called the Becker Amendment, which read in part, "Nothing in this Constitution shall be deemed to prohibit the offering, reading from, or listening to prayers or biblical scriptures, if participation therein is on a voluntary basis in any governmental or public school. Nothing in this Constitution shall be deemed to prohibit making reference to belief in, reliance upon, or invoking the aid of God or a supreme being in any governmental or public document, proceeding, activity, currency, school, or institution." Needless to say, a furious political battle ensued. On one side were groups such as the National Association of Evangelicals and the Fundamentalist International Council of Christian Churches. On the other were the American Civil Liberties Union, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the American Jewish Congress, the Anti-Defamation League, the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, and the National Council of Churches. The amendment died in committee after months of hearings, but only because it was chaired by a Democrat, Emanuel Seller, who worked tirelessly to give opponents of the amendment the political cover that they needed, because nobody wanted to vote against prayer in the Bible. But had it gone to vote in Congress, historians believe that there is little doubt that it would have passed, and we might have constitutionally approved prayer in our schools. Now, soon after, Seller is defeated in a Democratic primary for his opposition to feminism and the Equal Rights Amendment. Like I said, the story is complicated. Now, the legacy of this bitter fight is with us today. Those who believe that this is a Christian nation and that the Bible is a source of moral instruction for all our citizens were deeply wounded by the decisions of the courts and the failure of the amendment. In response, they dug in for a long struggle to restore what they see as a nation ruled by God's laws. A nation of rugged individualists unfettered by government or social concerns. In response, they created schools and think tanks and political action committees. They began to focus on gaining political victories in state and local races for school boards and legislatures. And over the past 70 years, they have achieved remarkable success, culminating in the last election. And they are currently packing the courts with judges because those earlier events convinced them that the way to change things was through the courts. So they're packing the courts with judges who oppose the previous decisions of the Supreme Court and other courts concerning prayers in school and abortion rights and women's rights, protections for LGBTQ Americans, and a whole host of other legal precedents that support our liberal values. The coalition that was formed over a century ago is still with us. It's still seeking to impose its values and beliefs on a diverse nation of many religions or no religion at all. And the struggle for our kind of freedom goes on. It's hard for us to know how many various deities were named and called upon here in the Americas before the first Europeans arrived, because so much knowledge and culture was lost or destroyed in the conquest and colonization. But there were many, thousands. From Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic Circle, the Americas were rich in gods and goddesses and spirits of the land and the ancestors of the native people. And the list of those names runs, like I said, into the thousands, and I'll speak just a few of them here from across 2 continents. Azaban, Tabaldak, Napi, Nanuk, Sedna, Kokopelli, Gitche Manitou, Wakantonka, Iktomi, Wope, Niltsi, Yaya, Atabe, Apu, Mamapacha, Bakab, Chak, Itznama, Kukulkan, Huehue, Coyotl, Chantico, Quetzalcoatl, Tlaloc. And then the Norse brought their gods, briefly, Odin, Frigg, Balder, Heimdall, Loki. The Spanish arrived in Mexico bringing their Christian triune God and the Virgin Mary goddess, although they never called her that, and a whole panoply of saints and angels and demons. And they encountered the Aztec, whose pantheon was even richer and more diverse. Other Europeans colonized the North, bringing their versions of Christianity, but also the folklore and folkways of the common people. Boggarts and brownies and hobgoblins, spells and amulets, nature spirits. And later on, French Huguenots, Catholics, Jews, Dutch Calvinists, Anabaptists, Scottish Presbyterians, Baptists, Quakers, and other denominations. And most colonies had little choice but to display some degree of religious tolerance, for their mutual God seemed to have many faces, depending on who was looking and where. And the slave trade brought Africans and their indigenous pantheons, as well as Islam. One estimate is that somewhere between 10 and 30% of the slaves brought to America were Muslim. And so Allah arrives, along with Mahu and Mawu and Legba, Agbe, Chokwu, Niame, Odumare, Nagai, Rug. And then there came Chinese and Japanese and people from India and many others who brought a whole host of other cosmologies and religions to these shores. And Shiva and Kali, Vishnu and Brahma, and the Buddha, and a host of other deities arrived with them. And although we don't have deities, we atheists and agnostics and skeptics bring other things to the mix: reason, philosophy, science. Although I do think we have Gaia. So to say that this is a Christian nation is true, but it is only partly true. It is also an indigenous nation, a Muslim nation, a Jewish nation, a Hindu nation, a Taoist nation, a Buddhist nation, a pagan nation, a nation of reason and tolerance, etc., etc., etc. And what binds us is not freedom under God, but freedom for and from all our gods and goddesses and spirits and beliefs. Because all of the traditions I mentioned provide moral and ethical guidance, and while any of them could guide a nation, and does, together they provide a broader, deeper, and richer foundation than any one of them alone. The original motto of these United States was not "In God We Trust." It was "E pluribus unum," out of many, one. That's our true motto, our true North Star, one worth fighting for. May it be so. Let's close with a blessing from the Chinook people. Blessing of galaxies, blessing of stars, great stars, small stars, red stars, blue ones. Blessing of nebula, blessing of supernova, planets, satellites, asteroids, comets. Blessing of our sun and moon, blessing of our earth, oceans, rivers, continents, mountain ranges. Blessing of wind and cloud, blessing of rain, fog bank, snowdrift, lightning, and thunder. Bless the wisdom of the Holy One above us. Bless the truth of the Holy One beneath us. Bless the love of the Holy One within us. Blessing of green plants, blessing of forests, cedar, Douglas fir, sword fern, salal bush. Blessing of fish and birds, blessing of mammals, salmon, eagle, cougar, and mountain goat. May all humankind likewise offer blessing, old woman, young woman, wise men, and foolish. Blessing of youthfulness, blessing of children, big boys, big girls, and little ones. Bless the wisdom of the Holy One above us. Bless the truth of the Holy One beneath us. Bless the love of the Holy One within us. May it be so.